2 guards had my arms before I finished my sentence, and I remember being more annoyed about that than afraid of what came next. I was still talking. I told the one on my left, which was not, in retrospect, the most useful thing I could have said to a man holding my arm while I stood accused of stealing from the royal treasury. Across the hall, Ivar was on his feet, and the look on his face was not the look of a king about to let due process run its quiet, patient course. "Release her," he said, in a voice that made the whole room go the particular kind of still that precedes either violence or the truth finally getting spoken aloud. I did not know yet whether the truth would arrive in time. I only knew that whatever happened next, I still had several things left to say to Lord Stewart Aldous, and I fully intended to say every one of them. Let me tell you how I ended up in that hall, because it started, embarrassingly, over the price of turnips. It was 9 days earlier, on an ordinary market morning, and I had absolutely no idea I was about to insult the King of Greymere to his face for the better part of 10 minutes. I was 23, and I had run my family's produce stall in the border village of Aldenreach since my mother's hands stopped being steady enough to weigh a scale properly, which meant I had spent 6 years developing exactly the kind of sharp tongue a woman needs to survive haggling with strangers from dawn until the light gave out. I was not, by reputation, a patient woman. I was, by reputation, considerably better at telling customers precisely what I thought of their manners than at pretending not to. That morning, a tall man in a plain gray cloak stopped at my stall, picked up one of my turnips, turned it over twice with an expression of profound skepticism, and said the single sentence that started all of this. "These are overpriced for their size." "They are exactly the size the ground gave me," I said, "and if you have a complaint about the size of things, I would direct it toward whoever decided this village's grain allotment should shrink 3 seasons running, while the tax collectors' bellies clearly have not." He raised an eyebrow, which I took at the time as the particular arrogance of a well-fed noble unused to being answered back. "You blame the crown for the size of your turnips. I blame whoever is skimming what should be reaching villages like this one, and if the crown is not that man, the crown ought to find out who is, instead of sending strangers to argue about vegetables." He set the turnip down. "You have a great deal to say for a woman selling roots at a market stall, and you have a great deal of opinion for a man who has not yet paid for the roots he is holding," I said, and reached out to take it back from him, which I understand now was the exact moment several people near my stall made a small, strangled sound I mistook, at the time, for someone choking on bread. I did not notice the crowd going quiet. I want to be honest about that, because it makes what follows considerably more mortifying. I was too busy informing this stranger, in increasing detail, about the exact economics of turnip farming on shrinking allotments, the precise incompetence of whichever official had last adjusted the grain tax, and my personal opinion of noblemen who wandered into honest markets to critique the pricing of women doing considerably harder work than they had ever attempted. He did not interrupt me. That, in hindsight, should have told me something was strange about this particular argument, because in 6 years of running that stall, I had never once had a customer simply stand there and let me finish an entire tirade without cutting in. It was the baker's boy, tugging hard on my sleeve with a face gone the color of old ash, who finally broke through. "Bryn," he whispered, "Bryn, look around you." I looked. Every soul within 20 paces of my stall, the fishmonger, the old weaver, 3 children who had been chasing a stray dog moments before, had gone down on one knee, heads bowed, in the particular stillness of people who understand exactly whose presence they are in, and are considerably more frightened of it than I apparently was. I turned back to the man holding my turnip. He was still standing. He was, I understood with a slow and horrifying certainty, the only person for 20 paces who had not knelt, because kneeling to himself would have been an odd thing for a king to do. "You are the king," I said, in the flat tone of a woman recalculating an entire conversation in real time. "I am," said King Ivar of Greymere, and did not look even slightly sorry about having let me finish. "I did not kneel. I want that on the record plainly, because everyone who has heard this story since seems to find that detail the most interesting part of it." I stood there with his turnip still in my hand and decided, in the half-second I had to decide anything, that a man who had let me insult him at length without correcting me clearly did not want groveling nearly as much as he wanted an honest answer to what he had actually asked. "You are still overcharged," I said. Being a king does not improve the size of the vegetable. Something happened behind his eyes that I did not have a name for yet. A kind of startled, unguarded warmth that looked entirely wrong on a face I would later learn had not shown genuine surprise to anyone in years. He paid for the turnip, full price, no argument, and left without another word, and I stood there in a suddenly very quiet market, wondering exactly how much trouble I had just bought myself for the price of a root vegetable. I did not have to wonder long. He came back the next morning. He wore the same plain gray cloak, no guards visible, and picked up a different turnip with the same profound skepticism as the day before, as though we had agreed, without either of us saying so, to simply continue the argument where we had left it. "These are also overpriced," he said. "Then do not buy them," I said, "Your Grace," and watched him flinch very slightly at the title, as though he had been hoping I might have forgotten it overnight. "Ivar will do," he said. "At this stall, at least. At this stall you are simply a rude customer who has strong opinions about root vegetables," I said. "I am not certain I am prepared to be more familiar than that with the King of Greymere." He almost smiled. I watched him decide, quite deliberately, not to let it fully land. That is, somehow, the most refreshing sentence anyone has said to me, at court or otherwise, in longer than I care to admit. Colm, his second, found me later that same day, standing at a respectful distance from my stall with the particular careful expression of a man sent to assess a threat he had not yet decided was actually dangerous. "You should know," he said, without preamble, "that the king has not returned to any single stall in this market twice in the 4 years I have served him. He does not linger. He does not banter with vendors about the price of turnips." "Then perhaps someone should tell him that," I said, "because he appears to be doing exactly that." Colm studied me a long moment, something unreadable behind his careful court manners. "I intend to keep watching, is all," he said, and left, and I decided I did not fully trust what that meant either. Ivar returned a third time 2 days later, and a fourth the day after that, always at the same stall, always with the same faint pretense of assessing my turnips, and by the 5th visit even the fishmonger next to me had stopped pretending not to notice. The 3rd visit was the one the village apparently could not stop discussing for a week afterward. Ivar had arrived just as a wolf pup, one of the half-tamed young ones the castle kept for the huntmaster's training, though I did not know that at the time, slipped its lead and came barreling straight through the market stalls, scattering apples and drawing a chorus of alarmed shouts, only to skid to a stop directly at my feet and refuse, with total and immovable devotion, to leave my side for the better part of an hour. Ivar had stood there, visibly mortified, attempting to call the animal off with increasingly stern commands it flatly ignored, while I fed it apple scraps and informed him that his hound had considerably better manners than its owner. The pup had to be carried off bodily by 2 kennel hands, still straining toward my stall the entire way, and I noticed, watching it go, that Ivar looked less embarrassed by the spectacle than faintly, helplessly resigned to it, as though this were not the first time something of his had made a fool of him specifically around me. "You are here again," I said on the 4th visit. "I am investigating a persistent quality concern," he said, entirely straight-faced. "You are here because you enjoy being told your opinions are wrong," I said, "which I confess I have never encountered in a king before, and find deeply strange. Perhaps I have simply never had anyone honest enough to tell me before." Something shifted in his voice, quieter than his usual dry formality. You would be surprised how rare that has become. By the fifth visit, he had stopped pretending the turnips were the point at all, and simply sat on the overturned crate I kept for slow afternoons, asking after the fishmonger's bad knee and the weaver's granddaughter by name, the way a man learns a place when he actually intends to keep returning to it, rather than simply passing through. I did not entirely understand what he meant by that until 3 days later, when he finally told me the real reason he had first walked into my market in a plain gray cloak with no guards at all. "I did not come to Aldenreach by accident," he admitted. The 6th time he visited, once the market had thinned enough that we could speak without half the village listening in. Reports of grain shortages from this border have reached me for 2 seasons running, and every time I asked my steward about them, the numbers he showed me said the allotments were generous, and the shortages were exaggeration, or bad weather. I did not believe it. I have learned, over the years, that the people closest to a king's ear are not always the people telling him the truth. And I came here myself, quietly, to see for myself before I trusted a report over my own eyes again. "And instead you found a woman shouting at you about turnips," I said. "I found the first honest account of this village's actual grain allotment I have received in 2 years," he said. "You told me, in the first 10 minutes I knew you, exactly what was wrong with a system my own steward has assured me works perfectly. I have not been able to stop thinking about it since, or about you, if I am being entirely honest, which you seem to have made a habit I cannot easily break." I sat with that for a long moment, the ordinary noise of the market fading around the edges of it. "Lord Steward Aldous," I said slowly, "administers the grain tax collection for this entire border, does he not?" "He does." "Then he is either remarkably bad at his job," I said, "or remarkably good at telling you only the parts of it he wants you to hear." Something in Ivar's face went very still, the particular stillness of a man realizing a suspicion he had been quietly circling for months had just been said aloud by someone with nothing to gain from saying it. "Say more," he said. "Plainly, the way you say everything." So I did. I told him about the winter my mother had gone without a coat, rather than pay the adjusted toll on grain sacks brought in from the mill, about the families 2 streets over who had started rationing bread before the frost even properly set in, about the quiet, resigned way the whole village had simply absorbed each fresh shortage as bad luck rather than question a system no one below the castle walls had ever been shown the actual numbers for. He listened to all of it without once looking away, and I understood, watching him listen, that no one had given him this particular kind of account in a very long time, if ever, not a petition, not a formal complaint filtered through 3 layers of officials, but simply the truth, delivered by someone with nothing to gain from softening it. "I am ashamed," he said finally, "that it took a market argument over turnips to bring me an honest account of my own kingdom." "Then stop being ashamed and start being useful," I said. "Shame does not feed anyone through the winter. If you want to find out whether Aldous ever actually managed to have me hanged for a theft I did not commit, and what Ivar's wolf did the moment the truth finally reached that hall, stay with me through to the end of this. Follow along so you do not lose the thread of what happens when a king who has been lied to for years finally finds someone who will not do it to him." I did not know, that afternoon, exactly how much danger that single sentence had just put me in. I would learn soon enough. I spent the following days doing the one thing I actually knew how to do well, which was arithmetic. I pulled every receipt my own family had kept for 3 seasons of grain deliveries, compared them against the posted allotments Aldous' office issued each quarter, and found, laid out plainly in my own mother's careful handwriting, a gap between what Aldenreach was owed and what Aldenreach actually received that had widened steadily for 2 years running. A gap large enough to explain exactly why turnips had gotten smaller and prices had gotten higher, and large enough, I suspected, to have quietly filled someone else's coffers rather handsomely in the meantime. I brought the receipts to Ivar myself and watched something in him go cold and certain in a way I had not yet seen from him. "This is not carelessness," he said, turning through 3 seasons of my mother's neat handwriting. "This is theft, sustained and deliberate, and it has been happening under a seal I trusted without question." "Then stop trusting it," I said. "Bring these before your court. Let the numbers speak for themselves." "It is not so simple," he said, and I watched him weigh, visibly, exactly how large a fight this was about to become. Aldous has managed the treasury and the grain offices for 11 years. He has allies among half the older houses, favors owed in every direction. If I accuse him without airtight proof, he will call it the word of a market girl against a lifetime of loyal service, and I will lose more standing than I gain. "Then, get airtight proof," I said. I did not come this far compiling 3 years of receipts to be told it is not simple. Something in me had changed since that first morning over the turnips, and I felt it happen in real time. The easy, sharp-tongued amusement I had brought to every conversation with him hardening into something considerably more determined. I was no longer arguing with a stranger about vegetable prices. I was arguing, now, for every family in Aldenreach who had gone hungry over a shortage someone had engineered on purpose. And I found I had considerably less patience for caution than I once did. Aldous moved first, and moved fast, once word reached him, through whichever ally still watched the market closely enough, that the king had been seen returning repeatedly to a produce stall run by a woman now compiling 3 years of grain receipts. He had my stall shuttered within the week, citing an obscure market ordinance about unlicensed produce sales that had not been enforced in a decade, and made certain, loudly, in front of half the village, that everyone understood the closure had come from his own office and not the king's. It was, I understood immediately, both a punishment and a warning, aimed less at me than at anyone else in Aldenreach who might have been tempted to start keeping careful records of their own. Ivar was furious when he learned of it, more furious than I had yet seen him, and reversed the closure within a day with a formal decree that named my stall specifically, which I suspect did more to alert Aldous to exactly how much danger he was in than any accusation could have. "He is testing how far he can push before I push back," Ivar said, pacing his own private chamber in a way I imagine his court had rarely seen. "And I have just told him, plainly, that where you are concerned, I intend to push back every time." "Then he already knows what he needs to know," I said. "That means his next move will not be this quiet." I was right, and it came 4 days later, in the ugliest form either of us had anticipated. A guard found, in the storeroom behind my shuttered and reopened stall, a small strongbox bearing the royal seal, reported stolen from the treasury the week before, along with a fabricated ledger of sales suggesting I had been quietly selling royal coin through my own produce accounts. It was discovered, conveniently, during an inspection ordered in Aldous' own name, and by the following morning the accusation had grown from an unlicensed vendor to a woman who had stolen directly from the crown. I was arrested at dawn. That is the scene I told you about at the very start of this, the guard's hands on my arms, my own outrage considerably louder than my fear. The hall gone still around a king who had risen from his throne before the herald had finished reading the charge. "Bellhollow accusations require bellhollow evidence," I said, borrowing a phrase I had heard once from a healer passing through market and never expected to need myself, and a strongbox appearing in a storeroom I have not entered in a week, discovered by the one man in this castle with every reason to want me silenced, is not evidence. It is a confession wearing someone else's name. Aldous, seated near the dais with the particular calm of a man who believed he had already won, opened his mouth to answer, and that was the moment Ivar's wolf, which had been visibly straining beneath his composure since the guards first laid hands on me, broke free of whatever restraint he had been holding it with. It did not attack. It crossed the floor of that hall at a dead run and planted itself bodily between me and the guards still gripping my arms, teeth bared, low and furious, in a display no court in Greymere's history had ever seen its king allow in public. The guards released me on instinct rather than order. The hall went the particular silence that precedes either violence or the truth finally arriving. "Release the ledgers Aldous has kept in his own private office," Ivar said, his voice steady despite the visible strain of holding his own wolf back from finishing what it had started, "and compare them against the receipts this woman has already provided the court. I do not believe her figures will be the ones that fail to match." Colm, who had clearly been quietly gathering his own suspicions for days, produced the requested ledgers within the hour, seized under formal writ before Aldous could think to destroy them, and the comparison took considerably less time than anyone expected. The gap between Aldenreach's allotment and Aldenreach's receipts matched, coin for coin. A private account under Aldous' own name that had grown steadily for 2 years. I did not wait for the court to finish debating the implications. I looked directly at Aldous, in front of the full hall, and said the one thing I had been holding since the moment I first understood what he had done. "You starved an entire border village so your own coffers could grow quietly enough that no one would notice," I said. "And when a market girl noticed anyway, you tried to have her hanged rather than simply be caught. That is not the behavior of a man defending his honor. That is the behavior of a man who knew exactly how guilty he was." He had no answer ready for that. I do not think he had expected the accusation to be spoken plainly, in front of witnesses, by the very woman he had tried to silence. Aldous was stripped of his office that same hour, his accounts seized in full, and the grain owed to Aldenreach and 3 neighboring villages was ordered restored before the season's end, with the 2 years of shortfall repaid from his own confiscated wealth. He was escorted from the castle in considerably less finery than he had worn walking in, and I did not feel triumphant watching him go so much as simply, finally, able to breathe. The court did not settle so easily. 2 of the older houses who had long benefited from Aldous' quiet favors spent the following weeks making pointed remarks about a king who let a market girl dictate treasury policy, and Colm spent no small part of those weeks reminding anyone who said so within his hearing that the market girl in question had uncovered 2 years of theft the entire Royal Accounting Office had somehow missed. Ivar did not silence the grumbling by decree. He simply kept inviting me to every council where the grain allotments were discussed, until the grumbling had nowhere left to hide. My own mother arrived at court within the week, summoned by a rider Ivar had sent the moment the ordeal ended, and spent the better part of an hour looking between her daughter and the King of Greymere, with an expression caught somewhere between pride and open disbelief. She told me later, quietly, that she had always known I would argue my way into trouble eventually. She had simply never expected the trouble to end in a crown. Ivar found me afterward in the corridor outside that hall, his wolf still visibly unsettled beneath his skin, holding the small dented brass weight from my market scale that I had, apparently without noticing, been clutching through the entire ordeal. "I have spent 9 days trying to prove to you that I was not simply a rude customer with too much opinion about turnips," he said. "I do not think nearly setting my own wolf loose in my throne room was the demonstration I had planned, but I confess it may have made the point rather more clearly than I intended." "It made the point," I agreed, "though I would ask you not to repeat it. I do not intend to make a habit of it." He looked at the weight still in my hand, then at me, and something in his face lost the last of its careful formality. "I do not know how to court a woman who is not impressed by crowns or titles, or careful protocol. I have been trying rather badly for 9 days to work out what would actually reach you. You already worked it out, I said. You let me finish an argument instead of silencing it. That is the only thing you have ever needed to do. He kissed me then, careful and a little uncertain, like a man who had spent years being agreed with and had finally found someone who chose him anyway. And I felt something in my chest. Some old, tired bracing I had carried since I first took over my mother's stall and started fighting for every fair price myself, finally set itself down. He claimed me before the full court a month later, his hand steady on the old iron circlet as he set it on my head himself, in front of every noble who had once assumed the market girl arguing with their king over turnips was merely a passing curiosity. Colm stood near the front of that hall looking, for the first time since I had met him, entirely unworried. 6 months later, I stood at a rebuilt version of my old stall, kept deliberately, at my own insistence, in the middle of Aldenreach's market rather than moved into some ceremonial garden, holding a letter from my mother in one hand and the same dented brass weight, reforged now with a thin band of gold at its center, in the other. My mother's letter said the grain had come in full and steady for the first time in 3 years, and asked, carefully, whether it was true her daughter had married a king over an argument about vegetables. I wrote back that it was, and that the vegetables, if anyone was curious, were still slightly overpriced. Colm had stopped flinching every time a market vendor raised their voice near the castle gates. Mostly, the neighboring villages that had suffered under Aldous' theft had seen their own allotments corrected within the season, and more than one farmer had taken to telling the story of the market girl who argued a king into finding a thief, embellishing it a little further with every retelling. And Greymere's court, once so accustomed to flattery it had nearly starved its own border villages without noticing, had grown considerably more careful about which voices it chose to trust. Ivar still came to the stall most mornings he could spare, still picked up a turnip, still found some new small fault with it out of pure habit, and I still told him exactly what I thought of his opinions every time. Neither of us had any intention of letting that particular argument end simply because the rest of the kingdom now knew both our names. I set the brass weight back on my scale, gold band and all, and thought about the woman who had stood at this exact stall 9 months earlier, certain only that she had strong opinions about turnip pricing and no idea whatsoever who she was arguing with. She had no idea, that ordinary market morning, that the tall, rude stranger holding her turnip was about to change the entire shape of her life. She only knew she was not finished making her point. I like to think she would be glad, now, that no one told her to stop. Do you think Ivar would have let anyone else in that market finish an argument with him the way he let me? Or was some part of him already listening for exactly one voice that would not simply bow? Tell me your theory in the comments. And if you want to stay in this market a little longer, comment the turnip, and I will know exactly what you are asking for. Thank you for standing at that stall with me. Wherever you are listening from tonight, welcome to Aldenreach. Follow along for the next story from this side of the border. There are more kings in these hills who have been waiting, without knowing it, for someone who will not simply kneel, and I intend to tell you every one of their stories.